It was so unexpected.
You had to be there.
Covering Celtic at that time was a brilliant thing. The atmosphere at Parkhead was always great.
You had to be there.
Nobody ever talks about this game. Nobody saw it.
You had to be there.
So this is the latest episode of You Had to Be There, and I'm delighted to say Rory O'Connor, rugby journalist with the Irish Independent, is with us. Rory, I'm a little bit shocked there's no Bohemians on this.
Yeah. Well, Colin kind of did say, your best 5 rugby moments, and I haven't gone all 5 rugby. I'm pretty blessed. I think that my dad took me to everything when I was a kid, so I've been at incredible sporting events, and I know this isn't about the event or the kind of the moment, but it's about an individual's performance within that. So I kind of stuck to some professional kind of, 4 of my picks were games I covered as a journalist, and then a 5th is a game that I attended as a kid. I was trying to think of an individual Bohs one or even a Dublin one, because I've been at most of Dublin's All-Ireland wins and stuff like that, and I couldn't. Partly it's my just really bad memory of actually picking out individual performances in games and going, God, what was I at that? And part of it was, I suppose I probably pay attention more when I'm working at a game, so things stand out more. So partly kind of trying to be professional and picking 4 rugby ones, and partly the fact that individual performance for both. I remember great moments, I remember great games, but actually picking out one player who dominated the game in the way that these 5 examples are is probably tricky enough.
It's probably when you're a sports journalist as well, you've been to so many games and so many different codes that it's kind of like Woodstock. You're like, was I at that game?
Yeah, well, it's also, I played rugby for about 15 years and probably drank a lot more than I should as well, so I think my brain cells have turned to mush. So it's actually, and I think, I don't know if you guys feel the same way, but maybe it's the amount of sport we watch as well, but everything kind of blurs into one. And my first pick is a goal in 1996 in a Premier League game, in a time where a good goal lived for a whole season, whereas now a good goal barely lasts a weekend. So I think everything's kind of mushed into one, and I do player ratings for Mondays though after international games, and I think that actually forces me to go back and watch the game through the prism of performance, and that probably is the reason I remember individual performances. And also I have to come in here and talk about it and write about it all
notes.
week.
Yeah,
I take notes. Maybe I should start just taking notes. Maybe that's where I need to start.
But the fact you do take notes on matches means that you probably have better recall of them. So let's start, right?
Yeah.
Georgi Kinkladze, Man City versus Southampton on 16th of March 1996. What's special about this?
Well, the goal, I think, and again, I probably misread Colin, the producer's text, when he first said it, and I was thinking about moments or kind of things you're at, and I randomly found myself in Main Road in March 1996.
We all thought it was just moments, don't worry. But
yeah, well, I did initially, and then I missed it, but I kind of wanted to keep this one, partly because I don't think there's many people who are going to come in and say there's not many people who can say they were there on the day that Georgi Kinkladze scored one of the great Premier League goals, and once I then had to talk about it, I've got to be looking at it a lot this morning at kind of what happened on the day, and he did, the highlights are pretty much all Kinkladze, but for some reason, the reason is my dad, I was a Liverpool fan when I was a kid, my dad was a Chelsea fan, Liverpool were playing Chelsea in Anfield, and we picked this as my first game to go to. I've been obsessed with Liverpool as a kid, we booked I can't remember if it was a ferry or flights, but we stayed in Chester, but we couldn't get tickets for Liverpool, and we were trying, we went to Anfield the day before, went to the shop, begged them for tickets, but we couldn't get tickets for this game. I think it was the day Patrick Berger scored 3 goals against Chelsea. I may be wrong about that, but so we were in England anyway, and Manchester's not that far away, and City were playing Southampton, so my dad said,
no problem,
will we go to this? No problem, absolutely none. There's the year City got relegated, so we drove to Main Road that morning, picked up a couple of tickets at the box office, went along. I think I was wearing my Liverpool away kit. Underneath my Liverpool, I had all David James's goalkeeper jerseys, and and my dad was like, we're going into the City, because it's outside Main Road. I think it's obviously all changed now at the Etihad and the Glitz, and City was a very different place. They kind of had a working men's club outside where we went for a drink beforehand, and Dad was like, make sure you zip up your coat, because they're not going to like the fact you're wearing a Liverpool kit. But they were really welcoming, and once they realised they were really friendly, kind of told them the story, they kind of laughed about it. We went in, the atmosphere was great, the match was terrible. It was I've been watching highlights this morning. It was classic 90s spring, but the pitch was showing the effect of midwinter, and this guy, and again, I wasn't a City fan. While I was obsessed with football, I knew a number of the characters on the pitch, like Dave Besant was in goal for Southampton, Ken Moncow, that kind of team. Letizia was playing up front for them, but I don't remember him doing an awful lot, and I don't remember a lot of details out of the game as I was 13. But this goal, he scored the first goal, which was a tap in following in. Again, I don't remember this. I watched this on YouTube this morning to refresh my memory. But he scores the first goal but this guy was just so much better than everyone else on the pitch.
Yeah.
And his second goal, he actually didn't win goal of the season last season. Tony Yeboah won goal of the season for the year, which in fairness was a pretty good goal. But I think this one's better. I think certainly people our vintage will remember the goal. He picks up the ball outside the box, and this is before Messi. You know, it was Maradona-esque, I suppose, at the time. He just leaves three Southampton defenders for dead without seeming to do an awful lot. Goes in, and then he just stops. And Besson moves first. He tricks Besson into it. And again, Messi made this his stock and trade, but at the time, it was just this incredible, just an incredible goal. He just dinks it over him and nonchalantly runs away. And you come to a game, like it's this kind of, it's the any given Sunday thing. Anything can happen on any given Saturday. If you go to a stadium, you go to a film, you know what to expect. You go to a stadium, it might be the two worst teams in the world, but someone can do something magic, and that transcended the day. It's something I'll always remember of a day that I don't really remember an awful lot from.
And then you're hooked for life. That's it. You're a football fan.
I was already pretty hooked at that stage, and City went down, and I pretty much detest them now because of what they've become. But I'll always I always kind of had a soft spot for them after that day because of the main road experience and the friendliness of the people, and because we saw something special. I suppose I actually had forgotten when I picked my picks. We went back to Liverpool the following year and saw them beat Middlesbrough 5-1, and Robbie Fowler scored 4 goals that day, so that was pretty good. Actually, Collymore was better.
Right.
I think he set up all 4 of the 5 on the day. That was a pretty good individual performance as well. But I'd already sent my text.
That's the season of the 4-3, is it?
I think it would have been, yeah. When I remember being frustrated by Collymore, watching him on TV, and then you saw him in person. I was like, oh my God, this guy is absolutely phenomenal. And obviously Fowler scored 4 goals, so that was a contender for my list, I suppose.
It's funny that those memories of going to matches with a lot of times with your dad or your brother or whatever, and the smoky, as you say, working clubs and like bars before games, and like there's something about that environment, especially back in the 90s and the noughties, where you just never forget those moments. It kind of almost brings together your relationship with your dad in some ways, where you're like, this is something I will never forget, those games. I
think for a lot of people that rings true. And my dad, I presume it was just, now that I have a kid myself, it was getting us out of the house, but we used to pack up every weekend. We used to go to Leinster Club Championship games across the province. I've been to Ulster finals, I've been to Munster Championship games. We just used to go to matches. We used to go to all Dublin's home and away league games. We go to Bows home and away. It was just something we did. We went to matches, and I don't know how much he must have spent on tickets over the years, because we went to all the Ireland soccer games as well. So I've been at some amazing things.
Tickets weren't ridiculous at that stage.
No, they weren't. I've seen the prices for the autumn internationals that are coming up, and you're like, God, how do you afford to bring your family to this? It's a different beast.
I think the sport doesn't understand that. Like, you don't hook the 8, 9, 10-year-olds if they're not at the games, because watching on TV, it's not the same. Yeah, and even like the idea, I mean, Liverpool-Chelsea was sold out, that's what I was going to, but you could turn up at Main Road. I don't know how many, I haven't tried to go to a Premier League game for a long time, but I don't know how easy it is to turn up at, say, Brentford or something and pick up a ticket. Maybe it's easier than I think it is, but it was like simpler times.
Am I right in saying City were relegated from the Premier League?
They were, yeah. Niall Quinn come off the bench that day. I think that was the year they went to the corner in the final game of the season when the bad information was coming through. It wasn't a memorable City team. Like, you look at the list of players, Uwe Rosler was up front, but Kinkladze was kind of like, even now there's articles produced about how he was the shining light in this dark period, and like, I just looked at he has a Twitter account. He hasn't used it since 2018, but he's clearly hitched himself to the ambassador bandwagon. He's still remembered, and because they've so few great players that they can go back to, until the current generation retires, he's one of the lads making a bit of coin off it. But why wouldn't he? Like, he was a. I didn't realise he played at Boca Juniors as a teenager. Did he? He was from Georgia. He ended up at Boca Juniors. Right. He apparently announced himself onto the world. He scored, I think it was a hat-trick in a 5-0 win over Wales, where he lobbed Neville Southhill from the edge of the box, like an absolute wonder strike. City apparently had already been watching him. They brought him in. It was part of that vanguard of first overseas players, non-Irish or British players, to come to the Premier League. It was a pretty exciting time, and although it's like, it's just a moment. Like, it's just this incredible goal, and I think even now, sated and all as we are by the goals that we see on a weekly basis, it was just an incredible finish. And again, looking at the highlights, it vindicated my choice, because he does basically everything the City do well in the game.
We even found a picture of him with a black armband for the week that's in it.
Oh, absolutely fitting. Figure out who that's for.
Okay, Rob Kearney, the Lions versus South Africa, June 24th, 2009.
Yeah, this was one I quit a job in a bank and became a journalist and went on this tour as my first assignment as a freelance. I was going anyway as a fan, and Dan McDonnell, who's a good friend of mine, suggested, why don't you try and pick up a bit of work, and I did. So I was in Loftus Versfeld on the second test, having covered the full tour, but also had a group of mates kind of that I could go to in between games. I was having a great time, but again, you pick these things and you go, God, was it as good as I thought it was? And I went back and, like, helpfully there's a YouTube video. It's like Rob Kearney greatest lines performance of all time, and it's just all his little moments in the game. And it's any excuse. I know you had this on your Classic Games Club with Brian O'Driscoll, who until he got knocked out by his own bravery, trying to tackle Danny Russo, and that they both got knocked out. Played a major part in this game, and a lot of players played really well, because it's one of the greatest games of rugby of all time. It's the most brutal game. It's still seen as the most brutal game of all time. But Kearney kind of rose above. He was helped, I think, just watching the clips. So, like, Ruan Pinar started at 10 for the box that day, and their kicking strategy was to kick long to Rob Kearney, which maybe shows that they didn't do a lot of research. He had come into the tour. He'd missed, I think he was on the bench for the Dining Cup final, Leinster's first win. He'd had mumps. I mean, one of the highlights of the tour from a media point of view was Hugh Faraday from the Indo, I think it was, asking a young Rob Kearney, who was a good looking chap around UCD at the time, how do you contract mumps? And the entire press back giggling away, and Kearney trying to keep a straight face. But he had mumps, and it interrupted the season, and he came in, I think, behind Lee Byrne. Lee Byrne started the first test, and Lee Byrne was just on top of his game. And the Welsh, I think, always have a head start in these things. But Byrne got injured. Kearney came on and helped change that first test, but the second test, he was just magnificent. And again, Conor Murray's one of my picks later on. He's one of the, as these players get older and probably become more conservative and have injuries and things, they become almost, people want to get them out of the team. But when you look at how good Kearney was at that time in his career in 2009, he was phenomenal. He scores a try, he wins everything in the air, he runs it back with venom, he causes the Springboks all sorts of problems. And he was brilliant in Chicago when Ireland beat New Zealand in 2016, but I think that was the day he will probably look back on. Maybe I'm speaking for him, I don't know, but that was the day that everything clicked for him, and in a defeated team, he was just magnificent.
It showed that he was world class.
Yeah,
and that's it's very rare that we don't get that many world class performances from Irish players, particularly in a moment of crisis.
Sure, yeah, and it's hard to dominate a game of rugby. It's hard when there's 30 players on the pitch and it's such a cohesive game to shine so bright. And that's one of the challenges I had with this was, I wasn't there when O'Driscoll scored his hat-trick in 2000. That obviously, if I was, that would be there. I wasn't in New Zealand last summer, so I'm sure there would be individual performances from that. I wasn't at Northampton, Leinster, and Sexton would clearly be there if I was, but these are games that I was actually at, and I just, even again, you go back and you watch it just to justify it, and Stuart Barnes was just like this guy. Everything he touches turns to gold. It was a phenomenal performance in a, like, I can't explain how ferocious Loftus Versfeld was that day. It was, I mean, Chalk Berger got so carried away he gouged Luke Fitzgerald in the first minute. It was hot and heavy. It was dirty. It was intense. It was everything a Lions test can be when things get heavy. And he just, a bit like Bowden Barrett against Ireland in 2016, when everyone was beating the crap out of each other, and he just waltzed through gaps and just played a different sport to everyone else. That's one that could have made my list. Kearney was magnificent that day.
I'd forgotten the halftime score as well, 16-8 to the Lions. Like, you nearly forget, because they lost the game ultimately. Like, the game was.
Oh, they had them at arm's length the whole first hour. And it was before the bomb squad. South Africans unloaded their bench. Lions lost both their starting props. They lost O'Driscoll, all to injuries, and like, it was a bloodbath. Apparently, the dressing room afterwards. I was in the team hotel that night because we ended up having dinner in the team hotel, and like, there was a group going out, but it was a small group. There was just walking wounded everywhere. Lads knew their tours were over. It was grim, and obviously the finish, everything about it was so dramatic. The drop goal, sorry, not the drop goal. The kicking. Actually, just before the infamous, which Ron O'Gara won't thank me for bringing up again, but the infamous up and under, which I think Tommy Bowe didn't chase properly. Kearney gets the ball in a similar situation and actually kicks an unbelievable kick. He kicked a couple of what will be 50-22s now in the second half. He had unbelievable composure when the game was getting away from the Lions. He was still doing the right thing at the right times as others lost their heads around them. It was an incredible match to be at. The try from Jack Fourie was incredible, and then the kick to win it was just what a moment.
It's good that individual performances on losing teams aren't forgot. Like, I guess Shane Walsh this year in the All-Ireland final is one that maybe over time people will realise, okay, he lost the game but was absolutely immaculate. Similarly for Kearney, like, maybe over the passage of time you remember the individual performances in losing games.
Sometimes they actually live with me longer, and I have another one on this list that will come to, I'm sure. But I remember Jamie Heaslip, who was much maligned as an Ireland captain. He led Ireland in the 2015 quarter-final against Argentina, and I thought, in a team that stank the joint out that day, he kept playing all day. 2019 quarter-final against New Zealand, Peter O'Mahony, who again I've been critical of over the years, he was the one who carried the fight to New Zealand over and over again. Even when everyone around them was losing their heads, he was the one who dragged Ireland, and Ireland were still in both of those games for a while through the force of will of those players. Sean O'Brien in 2013, when Ireland lost to New Zealand, like that was very close to making this list. He was magnificent that day, and was, you know, these are players that are very unlucky to be on the losing side. So it is, I don't know, does it live with me more? But yeah, it's a strange one.
The next one is Paul O'Connell, actually, and it is a game we lose. This is March 15, 2015, Ireland against Wales. Wales 23, Ireland 16. What was it about Paul O'Connell's performance that day?
It was his 100 cap, and he was the captain. And I'd say, just counting them down, he probably played another 5 games for Ireland before his body gave up on him in that horrible moment when Pascal Pape hit him from the side in the same stadium. And again, I picked this, and then I went back and watched it afterwards, because I was like, God, is your mind playing tricks on it? And it was just the day that Paul O'Connell made a couple of line breaks, and you remember those. But it was a day where everything went against Ireland. They went 3-6-9-12 down because Wayne Barnes started policing the breakdown in a way that Ireland weren't expecting. It was one of the days where Gatland got into Ireland's heads. Every power play they tried to play, Wales were jockeying them off the ball. They were making sure that whatever line Ireland were trying to run, Wales were just basically upsetting them. And it was one of the days where the Joe Schmidt system failed. And Sexton had a bad day. He missed a really kickable kick. He put a restart straight in the touch. At one stage, Jamie Heaslip throws the ball to him and he's not looking and hits him in the back of the head.
Right.
It's just one of those days where everything's going against Ireland, and midway through the first half, you know that this is not going to be their day. And they won their first 3 games in the Six Nations. It's O'Connell's 100 cap. If they win, they have Scotland away to win a Grand Slam the following week. And through his own force of will, O'Connell drags them into the game. And he... There were the 2 standout moments, or 2 line breaks. One is off a Sexton inside pass. I can't remember how the second one materialises early in the second half, but they are key moments in terms of just changing the momentum of the game at a time where it's gone. And Ireland end up camped. They score a penalty. They go 2 scores down with about 10 minutes to go, and they score a penalty try through a maul, which O'Connell's obviously fundamentally part of. So their line-out goes to crap as well. Best throw starts going wobbly, and all sorts is going wrong. And I don't know if Paul O'Connell looks back on this performance with any great fondness, but it's one of those captain's days where you can see his influence in the team. And if I flicked through it last night just to try and validify my own choice. He's everywhere. He's just, I don't know, is it because he stands out because he's tall, bald, and he looks really much older than all the other players on the pitch. It's weird, but he's everywhere. His energy levels for a guy of his, you know, the amount of miles under the clock were incredible. The condition he was in. And they're on the Welsh line. They lose a line out. Sam Warburton, of all people, who won man of the match on the day, he was brilliant as well, picks them off, and they get another line out, and they maul all the way to the Welsh line, and the Welsh pull it down, and Wayne Barnes doesn't give the try. And it should have been a draw if Sexton kicks the... Oh no, Sexton was gone. I think Madigan would have had to kick the conversion to draw it. But O'Connell was just the fulcrum of all of that good work. It was an incredible individual performance in defeat. And
I didn't realise that so it should have been a draw, right?
Yeah, at the time you would have, because we would have been talking about it all week, and like, you know, Schmidt went mad about it, but they had a better chance 2 minutes beforehand, and their line out, the throw was picked off by Warburton. So again, there was things in their own control. There was another moment earlier in the game where they had the ball at the base of a ruck and they had a 5-man overlap, and they went tight. It was all the things that 25-15 Joe Schmidt team was quite conservative.
Yeah.
And you know, at times they opened up. You know, Chicago, we're going to talk about later, they opened up, but at that time they were quite conservative. They were still, it was life after Darcy O'Driscoll. It was Henshaw and Payne in their first season. They were still finding their way, and they won the Six Nations that year. They went and won it the following week, but it should have been a Grand Slam, because it was one of those magnificent Ireland-Wales bloody blood and thunder Welsh defensive efforts. Scotland gets one over Schmidt, you know, in the cauldron. It was a tale as old as time, but he tried to change the narrative. He failed, but he did everything he physically could to do it.
It's funny you're talking about Ireland being camped in there in the Welsh half. Like, reading the match report here, Connell, a break from Paul O'Connell's sport, a lengthy 32 phase period of pressure. Ireland 15-9 down at that point, and obviously Wales held out. And
Wales, well, they held out by conceding a penalty, and then they got another 10 or 11 phases, in which time they had basically Kearney has the ball in his hands, and there are just green jerseys outside him, and he picks and goes. And at the time, it was a big talking point that Ireland were just not able to have any vision in the 22, and Schmidt hated that criticism, and it was a big thing at the time. And Ireland struggled in Cardiff under Joe in those big Six Nations games, and it was like, it's a difficult place to go. That was a great Welsh team. You look at the names in that Welsh pack, and like, in fairness, if we were on a Welsh show now, we'd be talking about the incredible defensive effort. But Ireland should have lost that game by 20-30 points if it wasn't for, I believe, O'Connell.
There's also Gatland was an evil genius. Which we refuse to accept that in Ireland, because, you know, it's like it was always against us. His most evil deeds were.
I think the English would say that, you know, he was able to pull a few things against them as well. But he had a great capacity to get under Schmidt's skin.
Yeah, we should kind of love Warren Gatland for what he's like.
I think in time, you know, I think the place is duller without him.
He was a worthy adversary. Like he raised the standards
with a great backstory, as all great villains should have. So it's. No, it made it all the more kind of every Wales game at that time, especially over here, because they weren't never that great in Dublin. Cardiff, and it's such a great place to watch a match.
Wayne Barnes wasn't definitely another villain that day. You mentioned his name, like O'Connell's quotes afterwards. He says, "We gave ourselves a lot to do early in the game with some of the penalties given away and the referee's interpretation," which was a polite way of saying Wayne Barnes.
Yeah, well, he just policed them in a way that they hadn't been policed all season, and I presume they were briefed by it beforehand, but they didn't adapt at all, and they found themselves. I think they went 15-3 down. Lee Halfpenny kicked all the points, and then they were chasing. And Ireland weren't good at chasing at that time, but because O'Connell was on the pitch, it gave them a chance.
Wasn't there a stat that we hadn't ever won a game from behind for a long period of time? There was like
one stage,
25 game run.
We were very good at getting ahead, though. You know, Ireland were under Schmidt. Like that was his template. That was the 3-6-9. Then score a try, but that was his template, and Gatland almost used it against them, and it was so smart. Like, you look at there, you can see them setting up for these plays, and the Welsh are like barreling them in off the ball, and you could see Joe going mad up in the coaching box. But he had a captain on the pitch who was, like, we all know. Again, you're talking about a player who was a second row. Second rows, I know I've two on this list, but it's hard for a second row to stand out in a game, particularly a hard working second row like that. But, you know, I would say it was one of his signature performances, even though it was in defeat.
All right, Conor Murray's next, and this is Ireland versus New Zealand.
To win.
In 2016. This is Soldier Field, right?
Soldier Field, yeah. A game that seems to have, like, I just constantly hear people diminishing it as a thing. I think possibly because it wasn't on free-to-air TV in Ireland, and a lot of people didn't see it. It was late at night, and because it was a weakened All Blacks team, not because of selection issues, but because they had injuries. It was in Chicago. There was an AIG gig, and they're sponsored by AIG, and they had to do a couple of commercial things. But I interviewed the captain the day before the game. He turned up at a big kind of corporate thing. So Kieran Reid, Malky Fakatoa and Ryan Crotty were at an AIG gig the day before the game, which would be very unusual. So yeah, maybe their eyes were taken off the ball. But again, watching it back last night, like, they didn't want to lose that game. It's not as if they handed Ireland an easy first win after 100 odd years.
No.
And Murray's performance within that was phenomenal. I don't know how many times I've done it. I should probably keep a record of these things, but I gave him 10 out of 10 in the Monday's paper. And again, you go back and you're, Jesus, did I get carried away by the excitement of it all? And I watched it, I flicked through it last night, and, you know, you forget that Johnny Sexton went off 20 minutes to go and Joey Carbery comes on for his debut. So Murray's basically playing with a newbie beside him, and he guides him through it so well. He scores a magnificent try in the first half. Again, it's a reminder of how good he was, because he's in that Rob Kearney bracket now of people wishing him out of the team, and you've got Craig Casey, you've got other players coming along. Gibson Parks knocked him out of the team, so he's hanging on in there. He's a veteran now, and people don't see him as a fashionable option, and he's still a very good player, although, you know, he could speed things up, and maybe you could do it watching what he was like in 2016 and trying to get back to that level, because he was able to do it all back then. He was up against Aaron Smith, who I think everyone saw as the best scrum half in the world at the time. Smith had been through a bit of a crisis. He'd been caught in the bathroom in flagrante and on All Blacks duty, and it had been on the front pages of all the papers, and his status had been diminished a little bit, and he wasn't as good as he was before, and he became afterwards. But like, Murray dominated him from start to finish. His try is just a moment of brilliant opportunism. He actually steps inside Smith to score it, and he just looks imperious. He looks so at ease with himself across the 80 minutes. And at the end, after kind of hand-holding Carberry through his debut and taking over the kicking for some of the things, he kicks a goal to put Ireland, as the All Blacks storm back, you know, as everyone says, everyone seems to remember, here it comes. Oh yeah, absolutely. Everyone seems to remember this is an easy day for Ireland, that, you know, they came back really strong, and I actually rewritten my match report to say Ireland blow chance. I two beside each other ready to use one, because that's what you have to do. And Murray kicks a penalty, and then when they move left off that scrum, Zebo kicks ahead. Survey and Fekitoa do an interchange behind their own line. It's Murray who chases the kick. He passes off the right hand scrum. They go up the left, and it's Murray who nails Julian Surveyor behind his own line with an unbelievable tackle that forces the scrum. And then he gives the pass to Robbie Henshaw to score the try that breaks 100 years of history and wins the game. And while the narrative has changed since, and Ireland have beaten them, is it 4 times since or 3 times? No, 4 times since in probably 6 games. That you had to win. You had to win the first one. That was the most important one to win, and I think Chicago shouldn't be diminished. And certainly Murray's performance within that was phenomenal.
The geography adds to it, like Soldier Field, Chicago. Obviously, it's going to live.
For me and Jared does, because we were there. I think for some people, it was obviously big, but like genuinely, it was on air, and a lot of people didn't have air at the time. If you had Virgin, you couldn't watch air, and it was on late at night, so it didn't have the same the I don't know what the word is, that the transcendent experience that you have watching something on either Virgin or RTE, because it's free and it's there. So I do think, but it was amazing.
It was
Soldier Field, and it was iconic. Like it was, it was the closest thing to World Cup '94, I think, that I ever got, because I didn't get there. So you're right. Like, as a venue, it was amazing.
Good night out, lads, in Chicago that night.
Pretty good, yeah.
I had a great week that night. I was working, because suddenly I went from like having a match report and a few bits to do to a 12-page pull out the following Monday. But the week was fun. I remember a steak dinner, Jared, at one stage.
Sensational.
Because
Chicago Cut Steakhouse.
The Cubs won the World Series. I went to see the Bears on the Monday. It was an incredible week. Right. So we had a good time, but that night, work took over that night. Well, I wasn't quite able to celebrate it, but I'm sure everyone else did.
We did. I lost a coat and keys that night. I still follow Chicago Cut Steakhouse on Instagram. They're a very good follow, and very nice people.
An excellent restaurant, yeah.
Recommend. The sides are amazing.
Yes.
The players were staying in Trump's hotel, which has like a giant emblazoned gold Trump. It's on a massive skyscraper, and it was the weekend before the election, and I just had this terrible feeling. I remember this isn't going to be straightforward, because Hillary was 10 points ahead at that stage.
Yeah, because I stayed on an extra day afterwards, so I think I didn't fly till Tuesday. So on the Monday, everyone had left. So the previous week, the Cubs won the World Series. There was an incredible parade through the city. Like watching the Cubs win the World Series. I don't care about baseball. I don't know that, but suddenly I was a massive Cubs fan. I remember when they won it, I was like,
can't understand,
roaring.
Bandwagon,
absolutely. It was a bit like the Queen's funeral in terms of crowds on the streets.
And we were watching it. I was watching it from Trump Tower with Rory Best going, "This is you" on Monday back, and like joking to him. He was like, "I wish." And we were watching it from above, from Trump Tower, where Ireland were doing our media. And it was just thronged. It was incredible. You're right. It was. I think there was something like 6 million on the streets or something.
It was ridiculous.
Something ridiculous.
Yeah.
And then
they were breaking a curse that was 100 years old.
Yeah, just like us. And then
the Mayo of
the rugby show. Yeah, well, even more. Like, it's a lot longer than Mayo, you know. And for a big franchise in a big city, like, it meant everything to them. So the show left town on the Sunday, and I stayed on till the Monday, and I was doing an architecture tour on the boat through Chicago, and the weather was amazing that week.
It was
November in Chicago, but it was like sun shining. And that night, I got a taxi back to the airport, and the woman was like, "I'm really worried Trump's going to win." I was like, "Oh, really? Yeah." Because back here it was all Hillary's going to win. Yeah, this guy's not serious. And the following Friday was the election, I think, and then the following Sunday they were protesting outside Trump Tower in snow. And you're like, "Wow, this is a metaphor." This is kind of this is a bit too on the nose, really. Like, the sun. This is the last days of Rome, and it was it was quite striking. And I think the RFU probably regretted the fact that they stayed in Trump's hotel afterwards. But I think that it was an Irish connection. The manager was Irish or something.
Right.
They were well looked after and everything. It was. But they had options.
Deep dish pizza.
All the food.
I'm sure, everything.
All the food. It was all tried.
But the architecture is stunning.
Incredible place. I haven't been back. Ireland played there in they played Italy a couple of years later, and my sister's wedding was on, so I didn't make it. But I'm hoping they'll do another. I'm happy for these junkets to happen if I can get to go.
Yeah, the Chicago Science Museum, if anyone hasn't been, obviously as a space geek I'm going to recommend that as well, but the Museum of Science and Industry, I think it is, the Apollo 8 capsule, the first flight around the moon is on display there, so definitely check it out if you're...
You've been there?
Yeah, well, I've been to Chicago, but it was only for a few nights, but I've been to that particular museum, and it's epic. Okay. But the boat tours are amazing.
It's incredible, yeah.
If anybody wants to bring us over to do the show, the AM show is actually the best show to bring over as opposed to the evening show. It doesn't really work from a time perspective.
Well, there's an anniversary of Chicago coming up soon, like, you know.
Manufacturer one anyway. The sixth anniversary.
We'll bring Conor Murray, you know, we'll remember the day. Sounds good.
So Maro Itoje is next.
Yeah, and I could have picked either of Maro Itoje's performances against New Zealand, either for the Lions in July 2017 as I look at it, or in that World Cup semi-final which I was at in Yokohama in 2019, 2 years later. I've never seen a player dominate a game like Maro Itoje can do, and when he's on it, he is just magnificent. He just, I don't know what it is about him, but his force of personality, his incredible athletic ability, his skill set, he just strikes fear in opponents that no one else can. He's physically dominant. He has a charisma that you can see from the stand, which is a really weird thing to say, but you can hear him sometimes, especially like the closed doors matches. You could hear him barking all the time. He's in people's faces. People don't like him because he's playing for England against Ireland, and that's fair enough. But he lived in Ireland, you know, between Saracens and England. Like he haunted Ireland for about 3 or 4 years there. And in this game, you know, the game that turned the series around for the Lions, you know, like 2009, except for they got the job done this time. He was just phenomenal, and he gives away a lot of penalties, frustrates people. He wasn't perfect by any means, but he lived on the edge. And by the end, the entire stand was singing "Oh, Maro Itoje" to the sound of Seven Nation Army. It's not very original, but it was pretty effective. He was brilliant that day, and again 2 years later, he backed it up against New Zealand again in arguably a bigger game for England in a World Cup semi-final. He was phenomenal.
There's a trend there, like Kearney being 23 in that year with the Lions. Itoje, the youngest member of the squad, I'm just reading there, and he was 22 at the time. Like the obliviousness of youth in some ways when it comes to the Lions. Probably Itoje and Kearney in those instances didn't think about the weight of the occasion. It was clearly just go for it and enjoy yourself.
No, and he's a deep thinker, Itoje. He comes across as quite arrogant sometimes when he's doing interviews and things, but when he sits down and does a proper sit-down interview, he comes across as a really intelligent, there's more to life than rugby kind of figure. But when he gets out there, he's an incredible competitor.
It does seem strange that Eddie Jones had that weird pop in his book about him not being captain material and needs to. I'm like, well, would you not just make him captain and see what happens?
I've always thought that he's a really obvious choice for captain. No, I've never been in a dressing room with him, but he's so important to every team that he's in. He is the alpha in the room. And maybe he's not great making speeches. And Jones had a go with Emirati Kanu as well, so maybe he doesn't like players who court the limelight away from their sport, and that's part of it as well. But I mean, Eddie courts the limelight away from his sport quite a bit. So
they've got Eddie 2 jobs, like.
Yeah, well, 2. He's got about 10, and you know, and he. I suppose part of what he does in the media is to take the pressure away from the players, and he wants the players to focus on the job. But like I told you, he's never let him down. Even when they were going really, like England go boom and bust quite a lot.
Yeah. Even
when they're terrible, I think Itoje is still brilliant, and sometimes he pushes, especially when Saracens got relegated, he pushes it. And he's trying to do things he's not able to do because he hasn't been playing at the highest level. But he'd be the first name in my team sheet. He'd be my captain in any team I'm in. And on that day, he was just first to everything. You know, it was a difficult night in Wellington, a difficult stadium to play in. Lions were 1-0 down after being fairly bullied in the first test. They did fight their way back into it with that magnificent try that Sean O'Brien finished off.
They got hammered for about 60 minutes in the first test.
A bit like 2009, which happened the same way, and they finished strong and they scored that try from the end of the world. Liam Williams started it under his own, in his own 22, and O'Brien finished it off brilliantly. But in this game, Murray actually scores a try in it. I think, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe it was all kicks. Maybe Murray scored a try in the first test. I'm getting confused. But Itoje is his work in tight, his maul work, his work in the air was phenomenal. He was ripping balls off lads. He was in lads' faces. Like, you're playing against the world champions at the time. It was before their sheen was gone.
Oh, they were
and they were starting to decline. No, I think they were starting to decline. They were at their best at the World Cup final in 2015. They were starting to come back to the pack, but no one realised it yet. But he could see that there was weakness there. And he was up against Retallick and Whitelock. And he was like, I don't think who you are. I'm going to bully you. I'm 22. I'm the best player on this pitch. And he was, there's no, even like the O'Connell line breaks and stuff, there's no great moment where he bursts through or he shines light. I watched highlights of him again last night, and like they're all nuts and bolts things, but he does them so well.
Here it's like a Maro Itoje controversial performance, and it's like 4 minutes of him tackling and not being pushed back at any stage, not taking
getting in people's faces. He's the dominant tackle stat that arrived 2 years later when he was brilliant again in Dublin in that 19 game where England derailed Ireland's entire project under Joe Schmidt. Like, he was great. That's another day you could have picked for him or Tuilagi. That was a magnificent individual performance as well. When Itoje is good, he's enthralling to watch, and he dominates fixtures in a way that I've never seen any other rugby player do. I did see Lomu live once in Dublin, but it was towards the end of his career. I'm sure if I'd seen Lomu in 95, I'd feel the same way about him. But again, it's a team, very much a team game. It's very all about cohesion and all that sort of stuff, and how the parts interlink. Sometimes one player just rises above it and is so dominant that you can just tell that he's a special player.
Well, I know, like, throwing numbers at people doesn't sometimes paint the best of pictures, but on that Lions tour, just reading here, Itoje made 49 tackles on the tour, 45 carries, 3 turnovers, 12 line-out wins and a steal. Like, that's sheer dominance by any stretch.
Yeah, and that tour was hard because they played against good teams every week, and he was part of a. Gatlin got it pretty right in that one. They played the first team against the Crusaders, against the Maori, and then against in the test series. So he didn't play against any bad teams on that tour. It was a really good, like, the Lions. I mean, Lions is obviously a good team, but that Lions team, I think, when you look at the names in the paper, it was pretty. Peak Johnny Sexton, although he was coming into, he played his way into form. Sexton and Farrell playing together, it was. They should potentially have won the series under it. Sean O'Brien was very critical of Gatlin at the end of it, in particular Rob Howley's attacking strategy. You'd have to agree with him, but I suppose Gatlin can say, look, I drew a series in New Zealand.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good achievement.
Yeah, Gatlin had plenty to fight back with. As he took the stuff out of his pocket that night, we had him over, and we realised that the beef was real. I like, in my head, Rocky Elsom had a kind of similar impact on Leinster that one season.
Yeah,
but like, I don't know if he actually dominated games so much as had big moments in 3 games in a row.
Yeah, actually, now that you say it, like that 2009 semi-final against Munster, Elsom was phenomenal that day. At Croke Park, I was on Hill 16, so I probably wasn't in the greatest place to analyse the game.
Yeah.
Probably had a couple of points as well, because at that point I hadn't become a working journalist, so I was enjoying myself. But Elsom had at time some great performances, and not single-handedly, because that was a good team, but they needed someone like that who just didn't give a damn to come along without funny. The baggage of history and
Conor Murray did
be a
the
rock
same
star
in that Ireland performance. It's like that level of those performances where you get over the line for the first time, I think always have more resonance for fans, and I suspect for the players who are involved as well. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, you can only make history once. Like that team in Chicago and that 2009 team will always be the team that broke the duck, and no one can take that away from them. Even though I'm sure they're looking at every time Ireland beat New Zealand, their chance at gala dinners and stuff is diminishing. I mean, some of them have beaten them loads of times. Sexton's been on the pitch for every one of them, and Murray has. Well, Murray missed one of them, but he's been there for most of them as well. Yeah.
I hadn't realised until the most recent Lions tour the tradition of giving the mascot, the little lion, to the youngest. Yeah. Remember the squad? So obviously that would have been Itoje in that year, but it's something that they should keep going. I think it's a nice little tradition to let the youngest know that they're still
I like the Lions. Lions is weird because whenever I go on it, I think it's a magnificent thing, and then I watched the last one from afar. I covered it from afar, and like the Sky Sports stuff just grates on me, and like a lot of the hype around it and the immortality beckons stuff can wear people quite thin quite quickly. But when you're there and you see the legion of fans who come over and what it means to the players and like just the calibre of the games, and yeah, those things, like I think in terms of squad building, like again the 97 documentary built, I think, is what the modern Lions is built on, and that's the kind of thing that they were doing, and they're basically all copying that. And it is like, because they try to hide it on them. I said they weren't doing too much messing on Itoje though. Like, you can bully Lee Halfpenny was the youngest player in 09, like, you know, he was tiny and young and quite callow looking, whereas like you're not going to be hiding them, doing much to Itoje to kind of to catch him out. Like, he's terrifying.
He will come for you for sure. Right, that is this week's You Had to Be There with Roy O'Connor. Good stuff. Thanks a million.
It was so unexpected.
You had to be there.
Covering Celtic at that time was a brilliant thing. The atmosphere at Parkhead was always great.
You had to be there.
Nobody ever talks about this game. Nobody saw it.
You had to be there.